This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources, your articles, your research, your notes, and we pull out the essential structural story.
And today, we're tackling a massive one.
A huge one. We're looking at the deep architectural differences between civilizations, specifically the Roman West, the Byzantine East, and the world of the Germanic tribes.
Right.
We're going way beyond the simple story of barbarians invaded.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure out why one half of the Roman world just crumbled while the other, well, it thrived for another 1,000 years.
That's the mission. To understand the history of Europe, not as a story of, military might, but as a story of geography, of structural constraint.
Okay.
We're tracing how the social structure of these forest people really set the course for Europe's political path.
Right.
Why the West was just intrinsically poorer than the East.
And what that poverty did to them.
And what it did. How that long-term poverty drove a completely unique philosophical and eventually scientific trajectory. It's a whole system, really. Geography leads to economy, economy to politics, and politics to philosophy.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. The foundation of Europe, you could say, Germanic society. The sources make a really specific point here, that we shouldn't think of them as, like, nomadic horse riders.
No, that's a different model.
They're described as forest-dwelling hunter-gatherers with some very primitive agriculture. How does that single fact immediately shape their entire political world?
It's a core physical constraint. I mean, to have a real state, a centralized civilization, you need one thing above all else: a massive, reliable agricultural surplus.
Something you can tax.
Something you can tax and collect easily. That surplus is what feeds the soldiers, it pays the civil servants, it funds the entire written administration.
It's good bureaucracy.
Exactly. And Germanic society, stuck in the dense forests of the periphery, was all about low-density production. Little farming, some hunting. It just doesn't generate the calories.
Not enough to support a professional class of paper pushers.
Not at all. Their economy basically guaranteed they would be a pre-state society.
So their political setup had to match that reality. No emperors, no ministries of finance.
Precisely. Central power was just, by its nature, weak. Kings were chosen by consensus, by agreement among the big guys. They were leaders of a tribal confederation, not absolute monarchs. And, critically, they had zero written administration.
Wow. Zero.
Zero bureaucracy. Law was all customary, passed down orally, and it was centered completely on blood ties and clan loyalty.
And that is such a crucial pivot point in history, isn't it? That non-bureaucratic foundation meant that Europe, even when it inherited Roman lands, it never developed that kind of centralism you saw in Asia.
It couldn't.
I mean, we're talking about incredibly sophisticated systems like Tang China's civil service or the huge bureaucracy of the Abbasid Caliphate.
They just didn't have the tools, fiscally or administratively. And that brings us right to their relationship with Rome. Rome didn't even try to absorb them as a normal province.
Which would mean what? Sending in tax collectors and governors.
Right, a huge administrative effort. Instead, Rome dealt with them as federati allied tribes.
So what did that deal actually look like? Because it sounds less like governing and more like a temporary arrangement.
It was transactional, but really minimalist. Their main job was military. Provide soldiers, protect the sector, the border. But here's the key point, the thing that really laid the groundwork for feudalism.
Okay.
The Germanic tribes had almost no administrative duties inside the Roman system. And crucially, they paid almost no tax.
Wait, hold on. No tax. If they're allies, why wouldn't Rome demand taxes? That seems like a huge oversight.
Because it would cost more to collect than they'd ever get back. Roman tax collectors needed cities, neatly defined farms, a money economy. You just can't effectively audit a forest.
So Rome basically decided it wanted soldiers more than it wanted an accounting headache.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the deal itself, the fetus, it wasn't a written contract with fine print. It was a verbal promise. It was based on customary law, on personal loyalty, on honor.
And that's it, that personal verbal promise.
That's the prototype. That's the seed of European feudalism and the whole system of vassalage.
Okay, that structure is becoming much clearer. But without bureaucracy, how did they maintain any internal stability? Which brings us to the famous Germanic gift culture. The sources say this wasn't just, swapping presents.
No, this was the entire system of political control.
How so?
The Germanic gift, largitas, it was movable wealth gold, fancy swords, horses. But it was less about economics and almost entirely about social ritual. It was the constant public exchange of loyalty, honor, and, Well, relationships.
But what was the political risk for the king in all this?
The gift was the physical proof of his power. By being generous, the king showed he was a winner in war, that he could provide for his men. The gift said, I am powerful, stick with me, and you will be rewarded.
And the warrior side of the bargain.
He gives back loyalty, military service, his life if necessary. It's a non-symmetric exchange, built completely on honor.
So the second a king stops giving gifts, his power just evaporates. It's not like waiting for a tax revolt. It's immediate.
It's immediate personal defection. The whole political order rested on keeping that gift system going. If it failed, you had instant collapse because there was no durable state, no written law to fall back on. That system of personal allegiance is the raw material for feudalism.
So now we have this fragile, decentralized foundation for the West, which I think brings us to the biggest question of all. Why did the West fall apart while the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, survived for another 1,000 years?
The answer is structural weakness. The West was just fundamentally poorer. It was geographically constrained and fiscally soft.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you look at the Roman Empire, true Romanization, the deep stuff, was only in the Mediterranean core. We're talking Italy, Spain, southern Gaul, the coast of North Africa.
The places that could grow the good stuff.
Exactly. The wheat, olive, and grape complex. That's what supports the big cities. That's what generates the tax base.
And the places the Germanic tribes ended up settling.
We're the periphery. Northern Gaul, Britain, Germania. These are mostly unromanized forest and rural zones. And Rome's main tools, systemic taxes, complex laws, they just didn't work well in those low-density, non-urban areas.
So when the Great Migrations began, the tribes were mostly moving into areas that were already kind of on the financial margins of the empire.
That's the real insight. It wasn't just an invasion. It was them inheriting an infrastructure that was already failing outside that Mediterranean core. The West was already fragile.
And the East.
The East was the opposite. It was almost shockingly wealthy and dense. The East held the ancient, highly sophisticated cores of civilization places that had been running professional states for millennia before Rome was even a thing.
So what were the specific engines of Eastern power that the West just didn't have?
They had three pillars, unbeatable pillars. First, you have Egypt and the Nile.
The breadbasket.
The breadbasket of the entire ancient world. The flooding was predictable, the grain supply was unmatched, and it generated continuous, massive tax revenue that was easy to manage. It was a fiscal machine that never broke.
Okay, that's a big one. What was the second?
Second was Small Asia, or Anatolia. That was the military backbone of the East.
Right.
Densely populated, lots of cities, and it's a fantastic defensible geography. Basically a huge fortified peninsula. It provided both the soldiers and the stability.
And the third pillar?
Mesopotamia, modern-day Syria, the Euphrates region. This was the hub of commerce, of urban life, of intellectual tradition. It connected the Mediterranean to the rich Asian trade routes. Yeah. The West had nothing like any of these.
So no dense cities, no big fiscal engine, no deep bureaucratic tradition. It really was a failure of infrastructure, not a failure of, morale.
Absolutely. The result was that the Byzantine East had a real, functioning, robust state with a professional army. The Germanic tribes couldn't touch it. The Great Migration pretty much stops at Italy. The Byzantine military and navy just blocked the way to Greece and Anatolia. The state was resilient in a way the West just wasn't.
Okay, but even when Germanic kingdoms did get set up, Vandals in North Africa, Visigoths in Spain, we tend to imagine this total overthrow of Roman life. But the sources likely the conquest was actually pretty superficial.
It was a military coup at the very top. It wasn't a societal replacement. You have to remember the numbers. The Germanic population moving in was tiny, maybe 1 to 5% of the total population.
So they just replaced the generals and the guy on the throne?
Exactly, but they couldn't run the country.
Why not?
Because they were illiterate. They operated under customary law. They had no tradition of written administration or fiscal accounting. So the actual work, the law, the tax collection, running the cities, all the paperwork, it stayed completely in the hands of the Romans who were already there.
The lawyers, the scribes.
The professional lawyers, the scribes, and more, the educated bishops of the church.
So the structure stays Roman, even if the king is a Goth.
That is the perfect summary. The sophisticated Roman bureaucracy basically just absorbed the unsophisticated Germanic kings. The new rulers quickly start speaking Latin, they take on Roman titles, and they have to rely on Roman law.
So you get this strange hybrid system.
A dual law system, often, where Romans were judged by Roman law and the Germans used their own customary law. But the civilization itself, the machine of it, stayed Roman, run by Roman specialists. The West was so fragile that the tribes inherited a machine they couldn't possibly operate on their own.
This brings us to the really profound long-term consequences of all this. What does this environment, poor, fractured, non-bureaucratic, do to the European mind? You say the West became a place where power's expression was inhibited.
And that created the perfect conditions for what Nietzsche would later call a resentment culture.
Okay, explain that.
When a society can't achieve material wealth or stability, when it's constantly falling short of the rich, stable civilizations in Asia, that failure has to go somewhere. It gets internalized.
It becomes a psychological inversion of values.
Exactly. If you can't achieve mastery in the real material world, you start to invert the values. Suddenly, the weak are the righteous. Poverty becomes a virtue. Earthly success is seen as morally suspect. It's a compensation mechanism for failure on a civilizational scale.
And this intense inferiority complex, this need to escape a cracked reality, as the source puts it, finds its perfect philosophical home in the Platonic tradition.
It does. The core idea of Platonic idealism is that upward movement. The world we see is broken, it's poor, it's imperfect, but somewhere else there exists a perfect, unreachable, ideal world. Heaven, the idea itself.
It's the ultimate escape hatch.
It is the ultimate mental escape from a structurally broken and poor reality, whether that's ancient Athens or post-Roman Europe. The ascent of the spirit becomes the only available compensation for failure on the ground.
So, the lack of resources and stable government in the West fueled a kind of mental and spiritual quest that just wasn't as urgent in the East. Why strive for perfection in heaven if your granaries are full and the state is stable?
That's the core difference. The rich, stable civilizations of Asia were focused on maintaining the harmonious material reality they already had. The West had to invent a way out of its disadvantage.
And that invented way out was science.
Precisely. That philosophical trajectory, that search for a perfect, abstract truth, eventually gives birth to the ultimate tool of intellectual mastery. Since the West couldn't rely on natural abundance, it didn't have a Nile or a Tigris, and couldn't rely on a big, stable state, it needed another tool.
A tool to overcome its own disadvantages.
It needed a technological and intellectual tool. Science became the final counter-weapon of the underdog.
It was the method for a late-blooming, resource-poor civilization to turn that long Platonic search for perfect understanding
into physical, material survival, and eventually into global dominance.
That is a remarkable path we've traced. From the customary law of forest tribes, to the fiscal failure of the West, the stability of the East, and finally, to this intense drive for an ideal that gives us Western philosophy and science.
The great narrative of Europe, based on this material, is really the history of a civilization that operated for centuries from a structurally and geographically weak position compared to the ancient cores in Asia.
So here is a final provocative thought for you to consider, building on that idea of resentment. If that deep existential pursuit of the perfect, unreachable ideal, the philosophical engine of the West, was truly a reaction to civilizational poverty, to trauma, and a profound inferiority complex, does that mean that the incredible drive for progress and technological supremacy has always been fueled by a need to prove that that original failure was only temporary?
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.